I'm ready. Hello, how are you? Hey, can you get these guys to come in? Okay, all right. Okay. The rules, the Rules Committee will come to order.
What are you doing here?
The Rules Committee will come to order. What's that? I don't care. The march toward an equal rights amendment began more than 100 years ago. This work persists today because the fight for true gender equality still has not been won. Our Constitution is still missing these 24 simple words. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. There has undoubtedly been progress made on women's rights over the years, especially through the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and some current statutes that ban sex discrimination. But laws can be changed, and unless full equality is enshrined in our Constitution, those rights could be chipped away. That's why we're considering H.J. Res. 79 today. This resolution removes the deadline for ratification, facilitating a full ratification of the ERA, and with that, all women will finally be guaranteed full equal rights under the law. We are also acting today to fight climate change and protect our public lands. H.R. 2546 designates 1.3 million acres of land as wilderness or potential wilderness. All the while, drinking water is protected, natural habitats are preserved, and recreation economies are bolstered. This legislation really is a win-win. It will help us act on climate today and ensure these pristine areas can be enjoyed by future generations for years to come. Now I'm happy to turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing covers two different items. The first item I'll address is H.R. 2546, the Protecting America's Wilderness Act, measures the collection of 6 bills reported out of the Natural Resources Committee, all of which purport to move lands into the National Wilderness Protection System or into the National Wild and Scenic River System. While I think all members of Congress would agree that protecting public lands is an important goal, Republicans have some real concerns about this package. First, not one of these bills has a single Republican co-sponsor, and 5 of the 6 failed to garner any Republican votes in the Committee on Natural Resources. That alone should be a warning sign of the majority. Second, each of these bills is going to remove large swaths of land in rural areas from development, which threatens the economic base of these regions. In many cases, the bills that are part of this package do not even have the support of the member in Congress in which the lands are located. Proposing to move lands like these into federal protection without getting buy-in from the people who are most directly affected and without ensuring the economic base of those regions won't be affected is a sure recipe for failure. And third, Republicans in the Committee of Natural Resources have expressed grave concerns that these bills do not take into account the real need for fire prevention plans and policies. Recent history has shown a need to ensure that fire prevention plans and policies are continuously updated and put into place, particularly to protect America's public lands. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on the Natural Resources Committee as they address these concerns. Our other item today is H.J. Res. 79. The majority claims that this bill is a vote on the Equal Rights Amendment, the proposed amendment to the Constitution to ensure equality of rights under the law on the basis of sex. But all this measure actually does is attempt to turn back the clock and retroactively change the deadline for states' ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment that was set in the 1970s. As such, this is not, in fact, a vote on the Equal Rights Amendment, but an unconstitutional, illegal end run around the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution. Well, I think everyone here today would agree that discrimination on the basis of sex is wrong. I think we should be clear about what the majority is doing today. And to understand that, we need to put today's resolution in the appropriate context. In 1972, both the House and the Senate passed the Equal Rights Amendment by a two-thirds majority. At the time, Congress explicitly set a deadline for ratification, stating that the amendment, quote, shall be valid when ratified by the legislatures of three-fourths of the several states within 7 years from the date of its submission by the Congress, unquote. That meant that the deadline for gaining ratification was March 22nd of 1979. As of March 22nd, 1979, 35 states had ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. Of course, 5 states had also rescinded their ratifications prior to that deadline. And I would be curious to know if the majority thinks those ratifications are legally valid. In 1978, Congress passed a joint resolution that extended the ratification deadline to June 30th, 1982. Since this resolution was not part of the original resolution proposing the Equal Rights Amendment, and because it was adopted by a simple majority rather than a two-thirds majority required for a constitutional amendment, it was almost certainly unconstitutional. But ultimately, it didn't matter because no other states ratified the Equal Rights Amendment by the extended June 30th, 1982 deadline. Now, 37 years after the second and probably unconstitutional deadline passed, the majority is now trying to turn back the clock and claim that there should be no deadline at all for the ratification of this amendment. And that's what today's resolution does. It simply seeks to remove the deadline for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, nothing more. Mr. Chairman, this is a highly unusual and unconstitutional action for the House to take. Accordingly, according to the Congressional Research Service, requiring a deadline for states to ratify a proposed constitutional amendment is not uncommon. In fact, it's been included in every proposed amendment since the 18th, with 2 exceptions, the 19th Amendment and an unadopted child labor amendment. But what has never been done before is what the majority is attempting to do with this resolution, retroactive removal of that 7-year deadline after the fact, and to do so by a simple majority vote in Congress. What's even more remarkable is how long it's been since the deadline lapsed. Even looking at the second ratification deadline of June 30th, 1982, today there are 20 members of Congress who weren't even born yet when that deadline passed. That's 20 of our colleagues, nearly 5% of the House. Simply astonishing. I note also that there are real concerns among members about the ultimate impact of the proposed Equal Rights Amendment. The amendment contains no protections for life of the unborn, and before members scoff at this concern, I note that in New Mexico, which adopted its own state-level Equal Rights Amendment, the presence of that state constitutional amendment was used to overturn New Mexico's equivalent to the Hyde Amendment. Without including a carve-out, the Equal Rights Amendment could overturn every single federal measure that protects life. That's a real concern that needs to be addressed. If the majority truly wants to move forward and pass the Equal Rights Amendment as the 28th Amendment of the Constitution, I'm all for having that discussion. But it must be accomplished using the procedure outlined in Article 5 of the Constitution. It requires hard votes, 2/3 of both chambers of Congress, and the consent of 3/4 of our 50 states. That's the only constitutional way to accomplish that goal, and indeed, that's the only right way to accomplishment. What the majority is seeking to do today does not meet that standard. Instead, they're seeking the easy way out. They're attempting to perform an end run around the Constitution. In so doing, they are asking members, 20 of whom weren't even alive at the time of the second deadline lapse, to turn back the clock and lift a deadline 40 years after it lapsed. And they're doing so heedless of the consequences of their actions. We can do better than that, Mr. Chairman. We should do better. Protecting all Americans from facing discrimination on the basis of sex is a worthy and laudable goal. It should not be cheapened with an extra-legal and unconstitutional resolution like the one we're considering today. That's a disservice to the American people who expect their representatives to uphold and defend the Constitution. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your opening statement. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.J. Res. 79. They're removing the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Congressman Cohen and Ranking Member Collins, we're delighted that you are here. Anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. I now would like to recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I strongly support H.J. Res. 79 and urge the committee to adopt an appropriate rule for its consideration. H.J. Res. 79, introduced by Representative Jackie Spear with 224 co-sponsors, would take a critical step towards ensuring the Equal Rights Amendment becomes part of our Constitution. The resolution provides that notwithstanding the ratification deadline that Congress set for the ERA in 1972 and extended in 1978, the ERA, quote, shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution whenever ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, unquote. The purpose of the ERA is simple and fundamental. It ensures that everyone is treated equally under the law, regardless of sex or gender. Almost 100 years ago, Alice Paul, who helped lead the campaign to secure women's rights to vote, proposed the first version of the amendment. She and her fellow suffragists knew that if women were to achieve true equality, our nation's founding document needed to be amended to reflect that core principle. Nearly a century later, it's long past time to make that dream a reality. In 1971 and 72, the House and Senate respectively passed the ERA by well more than the constitutionally mandated 2/3 majority in each chamber. It contained these simple words, quote, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex, unquote. In the years that quickly followed, dozens of states ratified the ERA through their legislatures. By the end of the 1970s, the ERA was just a few states short of full ratification. But then progress slowed, and the deadline Congress had set for ratification passed. A well-organized counter-movement scared the American people into thinking that a guarantee of equality would somehow harm women to stay at home, to raise their children, or erode American family values. Some of the same people that made those arguments predominated in the South, the same arguments that were made to be against a woman's right to vote some 70 years, give or take, earlier. What had started as a matter of broad consensus became another divisive wedge in the culture wars. Today we know better. We know that in the year 2020 it is unacceptable that women still make only 80 cents for every dollar men earn. We know that when women are treated with equal dignity and respect in the workplace, in the home, by our institutions of government, and in our society at large, all of the American people stand to benefit. And we know that a simple but fundamental guarantee of equality should be welcomed rather than feared. We have, of course, made important strides. The Supreme Court has recognized that the 14th Amendment prohibits many forms of outright discrimination on the basis of sex and gender, and various statutes protect women from certain forms of discrimination in the workplace and elsewhere, but that progress is fragile. The Trump administration continues an onslaught of threats to women's rights and to the rights of LGBTQ Americans on a regular basis, whether by allowing women's health care choices, including choices about the reproductive health care to be dictated by their employers' religious beliefs, or by enacting cruel and pointless discriminatory policies that harm military service members. And as the Supreme Court has moved to the right, it could backtrack from fundamental foundational decisions, as it has in other areas, and jeopardize the many strides that we have made. With ongoing efforts by federal and state governments to undermine equality under the law based on sex, it's clear the Equal Rights Amendment is more important now than ever. Thankfully, the momentum has picked up again. Nevada ratified the ERA in 2017, and Illinois followed suit the next year. Then in January 27 of this year, Virginia made history and became the 38th state to pass a resolution ratifying the ERA. So we are now on the cusp of officially making the ERA part of the United States Constitution. H.J. Res. 79 ensures these recent ratifications are counted. It removes the ratification deadline that Congress set for 1979 and later extended to 1982. As Congress already established when it first extended the ratification deadline, it has clear authority to take this step. Article 5 of the Constitution, which governs the constitutional amendment process, does not provide for ratification deadlines of any kind whatsoever. Article 5 also makes Congress alone as responsible for managing the constitutional amendment process. It assigns Congress explicit roles while omitting any mention of the executive or judicial branches. Furthermore, Supreme Court case law establishes that Congress has the authority to set parameters governing the ratification process and determine which ratifications of the states are to be counted. We are on the verge of a breakthrough for equality in this country, despite all the obstacles in our current political and social climate. This resolution will ensure that no deadline stands in the way. I therefore urge this committee to adopt an appropriate rule governing consideration. I urge the House to pass H.J. Res. 79. Thank you, and I yield back.
I now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Ranking Member Collins, former member of this committee.
Thank you, and it's good to see you again, and see you. Hope you get to feeling better.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to see everybody. Here we go. 3/4 of the states failed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment by 1979, deadline set by Congress. And yet today, the House Democrats are trying to retroactively revive this failed constitutional amendment. And Congress does not have the power to do that. That's the bottom line problem here. It's not a matter of if you like the ERA or you don't like the ERA. It's a matter of process and how we go about it. And just fundamentally, this is not right, and it's not the way to go about it. And that's what I'm going to talk about here for just a few minutes. The U.S. Supreme Court recognized this very fact in 1982 when it stated the issue was moot because the deadline for the ERA ratification expired before the requisite number of states approved it. The next year, the Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives, acting on the same understanding, started the entire process of the ERA approval all over again. But that new ERA also failed to achieve the required two-thirds margin of the House floor on November 15, 1983. Even the current Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a supporter of the ERA since the beginning, has said just a few months ago that I hope someday we will be starting over again on the ERA, collecting the necessary states to ratify it. But today, in defiance of historical reality and the clear acceptance of the situation by all the relevant participants in the original debate, the Democrats brought forward a resolution that denies the obvious. Now the proponents of this resolution want to convince their base that if both houses of Congress pass H.J. Res. 79 and it's signed into law, the 1972 ERA will become part of the Constitution. This is because the Democrats control the Virginia state legislature, and their legislature passed this earlier this year. But Congress does not have the constitutional authority to retroactively revive a failed constitutional amendment subject, to subject citizens in all 50 states to what may be the current political trend in just one state. The U.S. Supreme Court has already recognized that. The past Democratic leadership of the U.S. House of Representatives recognized that. But apparently we're not recognizing it today because we're intent on getting this done and to rewrite history. If you support the language in the 1972 ERA, you only have one constitutional option, and that is to start the whole process over again and make your case to the current voters nationwide. You have to obtain the required two-thirds vote in each of the houses of Congress and then win ratification individually from 38 states. That is not likely to happen because it is now well understood that the language used in the ERA would prevent states' voters from enacting any limits on abortion up to the moment of birth. Just in the last few years, an increasing number of the leading pro-abortion advocates have openly argued that the language of the 1972 ERA would require unlimited abortions with no restrictions whatsoever, nationwide, regardless of the view of the voter. To take just a single example, in a national alert sent out on March 13, 2019, NARAL Pro-Choice America stated flatly the ERA would reinforce the constitutional right to abortion. It would require judges to strike down anti-abortion laws. As more and more people have come to understand, contending an unborn child has no life to lose becomes impossible when we reflect, even momentarily, on what an abortion entails. Fewer and fewer people understand abortion as a victimless choice, and we must cultivate compassion and practical support for women who find themselves pregnant under difficult or oppressive circumstances, and we must protect the most defenseless humans among us, those living in the womb. One person's reproductive right cannot outweigh another person's right to live. The Supreme Court in 1992 Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision permitted states to regulate abortions in the first trimester or at any stage before fetal viability, provided they don't impose an undue burden on a woman's right to an abortion. In 2003, Congress banned partial birth abortions, which none other than also Justice Ginsburg called brutal. In a partial birth abortion, a living baby is delivered, feet first, and then the skull crushed before its chin clears the uterus, moments before live birth is complete. In 2007, the Supreme Court upheld the federal ban, which applied at any point during pregnancy in the Gonzalez versus Carhart case, ruling federal law did not impose an undue burden on a woman's right to abortion. Justice Kennedy's majority opinion noted the law expresses respect for the dignity of human life and affirmed the government's interest in protecting the medical profession's integrity. He wrote, "The government may use its voice and its regulatory authority to show its profound respect for the life within the woman. All of that would be swept away if the supporters of this resolution got their way and enshrined the unlimited right to take an unborn child's life into the Constitution." Further, the Office of Legal Counsel on January 8, 2020, issued a letter binding within the entire executive branch, taking note of Res 79 and stating the current Congress may not revise the terms under which 2/3 of both houses proposed in the 1972 ERA resolution, and which 35 states legislatures initially ratified it. The National Archives, which performs ministerial roles of sorts with respect to certifying the ratification amendments to the Constitution, subsequently issued a press release stating, in its January 6, 2020 opinion, the Office of Legal Counsel has concluded that Congress had the constitutional authority to impose a deadline on the ratification of the ERA, and because the deadline has expired, the ERA resolution is no longer pending before the states. Accordingly, the OLC opinion goes on to state that the ERA's adoption could not be certified under 1 U.S.C. 106B. The National Archives and Record Administration defers to DOJ on this issue and will abide by the OLC opinion unless otherwise directed by final court order, unquote, which isn't going to happen given all the constitutional problems with the results of this resolution that I have mentioned and the decisions that have already been rendered beforehand. Also, the CRS agency is also under, if you look up this amendment, it is also listed under amendments not ratified by the states and is put into the category of not being considered. So with this and with the many problems here, this is not, as my colleague from Oklahoma stated and others, this is not about whether you agree with the ERA or not. It is a matter of whether you're going about it in a way that is constitutional and proper. We feel it is not. We would say that this is something that should be opposed, and it's a blatant abuse of constitutional power. And with that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to say that I fully support the Equal Rights Amendment and that I look forward to the day where women can be treated as equals and not continue to be subordinates of males who have no basic understanding of what a female working mother or a single working female has to go through when we are denied equal pay for the work that we do, when in cases of domestic violence, often women are denied basic legal rights. In the case of Native American women, they're denied even investigations. I mean, very simple things. It's 2020, and I look forward to having a legislature, a Congress, and a U.S. Senate that would finally support women's equal rights. And I yield back.
Mr. Cole?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me associate my sentiments with my good friend, Mr. Collins. We're glad to see you here.
Thank you, sir.
You bet. Let me ask you first, my good friend, Mr. Cohen, with the recent vote by the Virginia legislature, do you understand the ERA is now effectively part of the Constitution?
I believe we need to pass this extension to make it clear, but I think the 38 states have passed it. The language said that when it's ratified by the requisite number of states, that was what was passed as a constitutional amendment. The portion about the 1979 date and all that's procedural, that was not part of the amendment. The amendment simply said when ratified by the requisite number of states, and has now been ratified by the requisite number of states.
So does that mean yes or no?
It means I think it's been ratified, but then I also think that Merrick Garland should be on the Supreme Court and that they violated the Constitution, not giving the President the opportunity and the Senate to confirm or not to confirm.
I appreciate your perspective. Mr. Collins, what's your perspective?
I would disagree. I mean, to say that procedural things don't matter go against the very committee of the rules that we're dealing in here. Procedural issues do matter, and we do not vote on ideas. We vote on words on paper. And words on paper said there was a deadline here. And that deadline was passed. They did do an extension, and it failed as well. And just simply to make this up, that now that you can go back and put this in perspective and say that all of a sudden it now is part of it, I think is wrong. But in regards to my dear friend from Tennessee, I wish that if I had my way, the Super Bowl 2 years ago would have stopped at halftime and we would have won 28-3.
Well, let me follow up on, yeah, well, I understand that. Let me ask my good friend, Mr. Collins, have any Supreme Court justices stated publicly that the ERA were to become part of the Constitution, the whole process would have to start over again?
No, in fact, they've not even really contemplated this. The only one that we have that I spoke of earlier was Ms. Ginsburg, who actually said they do have to start over. So that was the indication.
And has the Office of Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice contemplated a retroactive removal of the ratification deadline?
As I read in my opening statement, they made very clear they accept their amendment is passed.
And has the National Archives, the entity responsible for certifying ratifications, contemplated a retroactive removal of the ratification deadline?
They will follow the OLC's opinion, which says that's not valid.
Okay, when the NRA was extended by 3 years in 1978, was this decision by Congress met with any controversy?
It was met with a little bit of controversy. In fact, in South Dakota, the Congress expressed, they actually said in their legislation that Congress, and I'll read what they said, ex post facto has sought unilaterally to alter the terms and conditions in such a way as to materially affect the congressionally established time for period for ratification. And it's my understanding that South Dakota also explaining that allowed in Congress to unilaterally alter the previously imposed ratification deadline created a perpetual possibility of sudden change to the Constitution based on a shift of opinion. Again, it's sort of interesting as we're doing this is the political whims and the political wins that we're talking about here, which we seem to have dealt a lot with lately.
And Mr. Collins, do you expect that if H.J. Res. 79 were passed, it would meet with similar controversy and even litigation?
I think this would be nothing but a constitutional lawyer's full employment act. That's all this would be, and it would be tied up completely from the beginning. But in the main part about here, it shouldn't be tied up completely. This should be one that should go straight, express lane, straight across the street, and all nine say, no, you can't do this. Because they basically already stated this in the past. The precedent sets this mark. And instead of going through this, because it is a part that I understand that my friends across the aisle want this to happen, but wishing doesn't make it so. And words on paper matter, and that's what's happening here.
Well, my good friend, Mr. Cohen, on the website of the equalrightsamendment.org, established by the Alice Paul Institute, it states, quote, 5 states, Idaho, Kentucky, Nebraska, Tennessee, and South Dakota, have attempted to withdraw their approval of the Equal Rights Amendment. However, according to precedent and statutory language, a state rescission or other withdrawal or ratification of a constitutional amendment is not accepted as valid. Do you agree with that statement?
When the 14th Amendment was adopted, it was listed, all the states that approved it were listed as ratifying it, even though 2 states had decided to rescind it. The decision was made then that rescission didn't count and that ratification was the only substantive matter.
Mr. Collins, the majority claims that if a state ratified the ERA after its expiration, then that decision stands. But if a state rescinded its ratification after its expiration, then that's a question for the current Congress to decide, meaning the will of the states is subjected to the political agenda of the current majority. Majority only views state rescissions as valid if it supports their political agenda, but doesn't want the rescission to be valid if they oppose that amendment. Isn't that a cop-out? What type of precedent does this set for future Congresses?
Well, I think it sets no precedent. I'm hoping I'm hopeful this week we'll go ahead. And like I said, I stated earlier on, this is not about the substance of this underlying legislation. This is not about making something that we need. We have things that need to be in order, and there's things that I agree with Ms. Torres on that need to be in law. This is just not it. This is frankly, is a futile exercise to promote a position and to reward a political state that has decided to be a part of it. You can't, how is it interesting that you can send out and hold in one hand and hold in the same hand that you can approve it during a time frame, but you can't rescind it during a time frame that is set by Congress, but yet you can approve it after the time frame. But yet you're saying that a rescission that takes place in the time frame doesn't matter. This is what causes this. This is why there's a deadline on it. This is why it was extended, and it was why it was put forward. This is simply a determination to say, we now have the political wins to get it done now. We have one bad problem standing in front of us, our own law, that is now over with. And now we're having to fix it retroactively, and it's just, frankly, it would cause more problems than anything else.
Mr. Cohen, if the ERA as drafted in 1972 was adopted, would the prohibition on federal funding of abortion remain constitutional, in your view?
you know, abortion's not the issue. Roe v. Wade determines abortion, and I don't think the ERA is going to override Roe v. Wade, and I don't think that the Supreme, that's going to be up to the Supreme Court, and that's where women's right to choose is really vested in Roe v. Wade.
And Mr. Collins, would you give me your perspective?
I would disagree. I can understand that because that would be a perspective that you would need to have now, because this has been the most divisive part of this rule in this resolution from its beginning, and especially even if you go back, we do have a member, you notice there was, I think, 20 members you said were not born when this expired. We did have one member who was born who was actually here who offered an amendment at the time when it was extended to actually separate this issue out of life and of the standing for women. And it was rejected by the House. This is Mr. Sensenbrenner. Actually offered an amendment that would have took care of that question that you just asked. That question is very valid. And I understand Mr. Cohen's answer, and I would probably, if I was in his shoes, answer it that way as well. The problem is those who support the right to abortion do not agree with that. NARAL and others have all said this is the crying call of why this is up, because, as was stated in Mr. Cohen's opening statement, those who support abortion on demand and abortion continuing have said this is what they need so that they can overturn the protections, just as I listed out in my opening statement.
Mr. Collins, my Democratic friend suggests this is a question of whether one supports the ERA. But isn't it really only a question of whether Congress can and should retroactively eliminate an expired deadline, refusing to give the voters of today the right to have their voices heard? Seems to me that if you support the ERA, you should be very concerned that this is a resolution that the House is passing.
This is, again, I believe this is just, again, another attempt. It has nothing to do with the underlying ERA. It has nothing to do with it. That is for a debate that we can have. And I would encourage, my friends, and I think we've actually had these put forward, let's start it over again. Because that's what the law says. It's over with. This original amendment is now over. It's now time to start it off properly, as Justice Ginsburg has said, start it over, and then go through the process again. Once it's failed, that time is over. The clock is at zero. There's no starting the clock again. If you want to start a clock again, have a new resolution, have a new ERA. We can have that debate in this body. That's what this body is for, and that's what the Senate body is for, and move forward on that. But simply by the whim of a majority to change this and to bring it back is a disservice for the current political whims that ignore the realities. As I said earlier, my biggest concern here, and even the New York Times article earlier this year stated that the future of the measure is very uncertain anyway, and to do this would just tie it up politically for years, making it, frankly, a very much of an issue for those who want to keep it in the forefront for abortion and the other issues that we have been a part of and fighting against. This is something that they feel like helps them in that regard because they do see public sentiment going against the abortion industry. This is something that I believe that is the reason they're pushing this now, because this is the turn in the tide that is happening. And it's not new. So to say from the other side of the aisle that all of a sudden the abortion is new discussion, it's not. This was a discussion that Mr. Sensenbrenner had in an amendment almost 40 years ago. So it was already being discussed then. So this is not new. This is simply, as I said earlier, we vote on words on paper. And to vote yes on this, even from a political ideology, is laudable for your political ideology, but it's just wrong from a legal perspective.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Colorado passed this a long time ago, and I've supported it since it was passed. I still support it, and I'm glad that this resolution is brought to us. With that, I yield back.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Collins, if I could just ask you, this resolution comes to the floor. Does it have to pass by a simple majority or by a two-thirds majority?
This is simple majority.
But the bar for a constitutional amendment is significantly higher. Is that not correct?
It is, and that was one of the discussions that was problematic in the first extension of this as well.
So in 1972, when this amendment came to the floor of the House, did it pass with a two-thirds majority?
Yes, it did.
And you said it was revisited in 1982 or 83?
79, it was revisited. They actually, they extended it, the Congress extended on simple majority vote, which did cause a great deal of controversy at that point as well, because it was simple majority and not part of the original resolution.
But as you gave the recitation of the history, I thought I understood you to say that there was an attempt to start over.
No, I think there's been discussion about starting it over many, many times before. The interesting thing is even proponents of the original have said you need to start it over, and that one of the biggest proponents that was Justice Ginsburg, who said, "I look forward to the day when we restart this over and I have enough states to actually get it passed."
But as far as a second vote on a constitutional amendment, it did not.
This is not that.
Okay. Well, from a historical perspective, it's obviously very, very interesting. Sounds like the correct thing to do would be to start over, so we can spend our time doing this. I don't know if it's going to pass the Senate as written here, but nevertheless, we can spend our time talking about it, or perhaps we could do something useful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you. I think, as I've said before in some of our markups and hearings, I'm obviously a strong supporter of the ERA and have been waiting for most of my life for it to pass. I do have to say the novelty of our friend Mr. Collins agreeing with Justice Ginsburg, might be somewhat persuasive.
It's amazing. I agree with several of them.
Can I just ask that if the remedy you're proposing would be to start over again, would you support the Equal Rights Amendment under those circumstances?
Not as it's currently written, no.
Okay. I yield back.
Ms. Lesko?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I have to say, of course, I'm a woman. I support equal rights for women, but I don't support this. And there are several reasons that you have said, Mr. Collins, and one, it's unconstitutional. The deadline already passed. That's clear. Supreme Court cases have said, arguments are moot because the deadline has passed. It will be used to overturn pro-life state legislation, and that is clear by pro-abortion groups have said it. And third, women already have equal protections under the Constitution and U.S. laws. And so, Mr. Collins, I'm going to ask you a couple statements. I'm going to read a couple short statements and see if you agree with them. It says the ERA is unnecessary. Contrary to what proponents argue, the ERA is unnecessary. First, the U.S. Supreme Court has consistently ruled that both the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment guarantee women equal protection under the law. Would you agree with that?
I believe that is true, and I believe one of the interesting issues was earlier, and I think it's valid, there's a concern that laws change, but these laws are not changing. I don't think there's members in this body that would go against that, and in enshrining it in the Constitution, especially with this one, there's, I believe, a different agenda attached to it.
Okay, thank you. And then the other statement is, second, countless federal, state, and local laws already prohibit sex discrimination, including pay discrimination. Non-discrimination laws throughout the country at all levels of government prohibit sex discrimination. In addition, federal laws like the Equal Pay Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, and Arizona's Equal Wages Law prohibit pay discrimination based on sex. Therefore, the ERA would do nothing for equal pay. It would simply authorize Congress to pass laws requiring what the law already requires.
That's correct.
Okay. And that's all. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Morelli?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we seek to form a more perfect union, we must have an equal rights amendment, period, end of sentence. I support the resolution.
Dr. Shalala?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Existing constitutional provisions have not been enough to codify equal rights and equal treatment on the basis of sex. Let me quote the late Supreme Court Justice Anthony Scalia. Certainly, the Constitution does not require discrimination on the basis of sex. The only issue is whether it prohibits it. It does not. And he added, if current society wants to outlaw discrimination by sex, hey, we have things called legislatures, and they enact things called laws. But Scalia himself pointed out that the Constitution does not prohibit discrimination based on sex. I yield back. I support.
Mr. DeSaulnier? Did you want to say something, Doug?
No, I think it was interesting. I appreciate the gentlelady bringing that point out. That was in a dissent in which he lost to Justice Ginsburg's opinion that I read earlier in that.
Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Please leave anything, yes, Mr. Carter? No. Please leave anything you'd like inserted into the record with our stenographer. You're now excused. This will, are there any other members who wish to testify on H.J. Res. 79? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on H.J. Res. 79. I'd like now to call up our next panel to testify on H.R. 2546, the Protecting America's Wilderness Act. Ms. DeGette and Mr. Westerman, we're delighted that you're here, and anything you all brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. I now recognize the distinguished lady from Colorado, Mrs. DeGette.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and members of the
Is your
committee.
mic on?
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to thank you for convening today to consider HRS 2546, the Protecting America's Wilderness Act. The Rules Committee print for this bill combines a number of previous standalone proposals that protect America's public lands and help us prepare for the impacts of climate change. Each one of these bills has been considered and favorably reported by the House Natural Resources Committee in this Congress. Title I of the Rules Committee print includes my bill, the Colorado Wilderness Act, which I will elaborate on momentarily. Title II contains the Northwest California Wilderness, Recreation, and Working Forest Act, introduced by my Natural Resources Committee colleague and the chair of the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee, Representative Jared Huffman. Title III includes Representative Salud Carbajal's Central Coast Heritage Protection Act. Title IV includes the San Gabriel Mountains, Foothills, and Rivers Protection Act, brought forth by Representative Judy Chu, which incorporates additional recommendations from a National Park Service Special Resources Study that supported the initial establishment of the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument in 2014. Title V includes Rim of the Valley Corridor Protection Act, offered by Representative Adam Schiff, which would similarly expand the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area based on another Park Service study. And last but not least, Title VI includes Representative Derek Kilmer's Wild Olympics Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. In total, Mr. Chairman, this bill, Protecting America's Wilderness Act, would designate more than 1.3 million acres of public land as new, expanded, or potential wilderness in Colorado, California, and Washington, while adding more than 1,000 miles of rivers to the National Wild and Scenic River System. Other provisions would expand or designate new recreation areas, national monuments, scenic and special management areas, restoration areas, trails, and other visitor use facilities. The designations in this bill will help protect clean air and clean water, wildlife habitat, and world-class recreation opportunities, which will promote jobs and support local economies that are reliant on our multi-billion-dollar outdoor recreation economy. While each of these titles has its own merits and diverse collection of supporters, collectively, they represent another meaningful action by the House Natural Resources Committee in our effort to address climate change. I'd like briefly, if I may, Mr. Chairman, to talk about the merits and work that have gone into my bill, the Colorado Wilderness Act, that I have been pursuing for more than 20 years. I believe that my bill helps shed light on the important work and significant support that have gone into the creation of this package of bills. The bill before us will permanently protect more than 600,000 acres of wilderness in 32 areas across Colorado. It is the product of decades of work, countless community meetings, and dozens of visits to some of the most remote areas in my state. If approved, this bill will not only protect these public lands from the threat of future development or the harm that comes from drilling for oil and natural gas, it will also further bolster our state's thriving tourism and outdoor recreation industries. And, most importantly, I think, It will help ensure that some of our state's most majestic landscapes remain available for future generations to enjoy. The only thing more amazing than the 32 areas this bill will protect is the support we received along the way. I've received more than 14,000 letters of support from Colorado residents and endorsements from more than 350 businesses throughout the state. I personally have been to most of the areas in this bill, by foot, by horse, and by raft, to experience them. I've met with landowners and ranchers across the state to get their feedback from, and when necessary, to adjust the plan to address their concerns. I collaborated with the National Guard Bureau and Colorado National Guard, and I worked hand in hand with countless stakeholder groups to ensure this bill will not only protect our public lands, but provide a real boost to Colorado's economy. This type of collaboration is not unique to my bill, however. Every single title of this omnibus legislation reflects that commitment to our local communities. By providing lasting protections for large, connected landscapes in Colorado, California, and Washington, we're helping to ensure that the areas are passed on unimpaired for the benefit of future generations of Americans. Thanks again for considering this bill, and I'm here to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee. On behalf of Ranking Member Rob Bishop, I thank you for this opportunity to testify on the proposed rule for H.R. 2546, which includes 5 other unrelated wilderness bills. Some of the provisions of this package are opposed by the member of Congress that represent the areas affected. A number of provisions are opposed by local stakeholders or counties. There are also provisions in this package that pose unnecessary and potentially detrimental impacts upon military readiness activities. Public land decisions should be made with local collaboration and input. They have real consequences for communities on the ground who live with consequences of bad policy. Mr. Chairman, we already have 803 wilderness areas in our country that account for 111 million acres of land. To put that in perspective, that's wilderness area that's larger than the state of California that already exists in our country. And we have heard talk about how this is good for the climate, but I would like to make the argument that I think this will actually be detrimental for the climate. By definition, there's a very eloquent definition about what a wilderness area is. It says a wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. That sounds very beautiful and poetic. The word untrammeled, it's defined as the forces of nature operate unrestrained and unaltered. When we put our federal lands into wilderness area, that means it's a hands-off approach. Now, that's a good thing for some areas, but when we put too much land in wilderness areas and we're taking off all management abilities for those areas, I believe we're setting ourselves up for more catastrophic wildfires, for more insects and disease infestation, and as weather and climate changes, we need the opportunity to be flexible to address these issues as they arise. Collectively, H.R. 2546, which impacts lands in California, Colorado, and Washington, creates nearly 1.5 million acres of new wilderness, which again is the most restrictive federal land use classification that we have. It also designates 843 miles of wild and scenic rivers and creates 100,000 acres of national monument expansion. This will add massive new management burdens to federal agencies when what we really need to do is manage the land that we already have instead of adding more land. Many of the local communities impacted by this wilderness package have raised significant concerns ranging from the loss of motorized access and recreation, the elimination of multiple use of the land, and the overall threat to rural economies. These western states also face increased threat of catastrophic wildfire from new wilderness areas and wild and scenic river designations. These will effectively restrict forest management across wide swaths of federal land in 3 states that rank in the top 10 nationally for severe wildfire threat. More broadly, it will also inhibit local stakeholders, agencies, and private landowners from maintaining the areas they know better than anyone. Resource stewardship does not have to be a partisan issue. It's not this committee's responsibility to federally mandate sweeping policy changes without local input and bipartisan support. None of the bills contained in this package comes close to the type of balance and local consensus necessary for bills of this magnitude. H.R. 2546 is ideological, it's partisan, and it will go nowhere in the Senate. And I've just received a letter from the White House, a statement of administrative policy that is the President has issued a veto threat on the language as well, or on the the legislation as well in its current state. There have been several amendments that have been filed to address these concerns by me, by Congressman McClintock and Congressman Tipton, whose district is directly affected by Title I of H.R. 2546. I ask that you make these amendments in order in hopes of correcting some of the faults that are in this bill. Thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I'm also happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Torres?
Mr. Gatt, on last week when the President gave the State of the Union address, he said that to address the issue of climate change, his plan would be to plant 1 trillion trees. It would be laughable if the situation of climate change wasn't so serious. Do you think simply planting trees is a good strategy without fully going into what this bill is trying to get into?
Well, one thing I'll say, particularly in the areas up in Washington State, there's already a lot of trees there. So why say you're having a policy to plant 1 trillion trees and at the same time advocate cutting down trees? Most of the areas in my legislation in the Colorado Wilderness Act are lower-lying canyon country, but still protecting these wild places and protecting the ecosystems does a lot to simply start at a place where we can start and then build climate programs beyond that. Why tear them down just to try to plant some trees?
Right. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Mr. Cole?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My friend, Mr. Westerman, mentioned this, but I'd ask unanimous consent to place a statement of administration policy into the record in which the President's advisors tell us they would recommend a veto on H.R. 2546 were it to pass.
Well, without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Westerman, as we've seen when the Natural Resources Committee brought H.R. 823 to the Rules Committee, parts of this legislation before us today pertain to land and members' districts who were not consulted and therefore lacks the type of local consensus required for a bill of this scale. Do you have any sense as to why the committee is continuing a troubling trend of moving bills that are not supported by the members who represent the impacted areas?
Thank you, Mr. Cole. It's unfortunate because when you put land into a wilderness area, and I've helped put some land in wilderness area back in my home state, but it was land that went through a process of study. It had total buy-in by the local community and the collaborators on the project, and it was a positive thing when that land went into a wilderness area. And scientifically, I think we're making a bad mistake when we step out and just automatically put land into a wilderness area that it may be land that's been affected by man at some point in time, that's not in the ecological process where it should go back to wilderness, where it can remain untouched by man, where nature is allowed to have its way with the land. So I think it's bad science and it's bad policy when we just arbitrarily put a couple million acres more into wilderness area.
Well, it's pretty bad politics, too. When the members that represent the areas aren't consulted and don't consent, I mean, for people outside that area to think they have more knowledge than the member that actually has been elected by people, that concerns me. I will just tell you as a member. Let me ask you additional question, if I may. Given that the fact that some of the California wildfires originated in wilderness areas, how will designating so much land as wilderness impact the ability of first responders to deal with wildfires and other natural disasters?
Well, in a true wilderness area, you let the fire start and you let it burn until it gets out of the wilderness area. Most fires start by lightning strikes. So just because you designated a wilderness area doesn't mean you're going to stop fire from starting. And if you've got an area that's overgrown or has insect infestation, you're going to have catastrophic fires that aren't going to stay within the boundaries. The fires, the insects, they don't know where the boundary line is, and they're going to spread out not just to other public land, but also to private lands. And it was mentioned about the Trillion Tree Initiative. That's based on a research report out of Switzerland that says that we could offset 205 gigatons of the Earth's carbon by planting 1 trillion trees, and there's space on the Earth to do it. It's not a U.S. initiative. We don't have that much space. We've got 300 billion trees in the United States right now. So I certainly don't think it's a laughable approach, and it's actually the most proactive and pragmatic approach to getting the existing carbon that's in the atmosphere out. I challenge anyone who thinks planting trees is a bad idea to tell me how you're going to get the carbon out of the atmosphere that's already there. There's not another approach anywhere close to being as proven as trees at capturing carbon and storing that in the wood. And the reason we want to harvest trees is because we can store that carbon in this table in buildings for as long as it's there. So we're unlimited in how much carbon we can pull out of the atmosphere when we manage our forest and we do it sustainably and we build things out of wood. So we're going backwards when we set forest land aside and said we're just going to let it burn up in catastrophic wildfire instead of using that as a tool to help in the fight against carbon.
Let me ask you one additional question, if I may, because you're too modest to mention it, but we all have different expertise in different areas. Could you just state for the record, you seem pretty knowledgeable when you talk about forests. Why is that? What are your credentials?
Well, I'm licensed as a forester. I studied forestry at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences, which is the original forestry school started by Gifford Pinchot.
So you think maybe the trillion tree proposal is pretty serious and pretty good one?
I think it is. Again, I think it's the most pragmatic and proactive approach we can take as a society and across the world to stop deforestation, to take care of the forest that we have, and again, to sequester carbon in a way that no other mechanism that we know can do. There's even, I can give you stacks of research papers that show that the most proactive approach to mitigating carbon is to have sustainably managed forest and to use wood products out of the forest, which requires taking some of the trees out.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, and I guess just a statement and then ask some questions of Ms. Daggett. I don't think anybody's objecting to 1 trillion trees. I think that's a heck of a start, and it ought to be done. There's no question about it. But this is a different subject, I'd say to my friend from Oklahoma. This is about wilderness areas and public space, and for me, I would agree with the gentleman that you want to have collaboration, you want to have consultation, you want to have agreement on these kinds of things. And I know that most of these issues have been been discussed for decades now. Certainly in Colorado they have. And at some point, though, the member doesn't have a veto over the rest of the state and the desires of the rest of the citizens of that particular state or that region. So that would be sort of my response to you. Absolutely, the consultation collaboration is key to all of this. So I would just say to my friend from Colorado, because I got another friend from Colorado here, I'm going to hear the other side of the story, but what efforts have gone into your bringing the Colorado Wilderness Act to us today?
So thank you for the question. So this bill originally was started by a whole coalition of groups in the 1990s. About 2/3 of the areas in the Colorado Wilderness Act were established in the 1980s as wilderness study areas by the Bureau of Land Management. Originally, in the Wilderness Act of 64, they only contemplated the high alpine areas, the Forest Service areas we're so familiar with when we see the pictures of places like Colorado. But then in the 1980s, people realized canyon country could have the same special wilderness characteristics. So about 2/3 of the area in my bill, as I said, was designated in the 80s as wilderness study areas. And they've been managed like they were wilderness for 30 years, since the 1980s. In the 1990s, a coalition of groups, mostly on the western slope and in southern Colorado, got together with an effort to inventory the rest of that wilderness. And what they did was they went throughout the western part of the state, consulting with local groups, local elected officials, citizens, anybody they could think of, and they developed what then became the original Colorado Wilderness Bill that I introduced for the first time in 1999. After that point then, I went around and my staff went around the state consulting with local elected officials, county commissioners, citizens, business people, you name it, for the next 20 years up until now. And everybody has been consulted with. Mr. Tipton and I are friends, and Mr. Lamborn and I are friends too, and they will both tell you we might disagree on the ultimate disposition of this bill, but we have worked with them and their staffs throughout. Mr. Lamborn, in fact, actually went out and looked at one of the wilderness areas in his district with me. So we get to today, and it's as you say, Mr. Perlmutter, all of the local groups have been consulted with, and the citizens and the business people and the elected officials. But I don't believe that just one group of local officials or even one member of Congress should have veto power when the citizens agree with it and where it makes sense to be wilderness. And that's why in October of 2019, there was a poll done, and it was an extensive poll, and it was of western and southwestern Colorado, mostly the 3rd and 5th congressional districts. And what it showed was 71% of the citizens in that area believe that those areas that are mostly BLM wilderness study areas should be made wilderness. There was an overwhelming amount of support on the western slope among citizens for this wilderness. And I think ultimately the people who are going to decide about this bill are going to be the members of Congress and the citizens.
Thank you. Mr. Westerman, any response to either of my comments or her discussion?
Well, I was just thinking that if, I've not had this happen to me, but if somebody tried to designate a wilderness area in my district or do anything in my district without at least my agreement on it, I think most of us would probably be offended by that. There's a way we can work together to come up with solutions where we can at least have the members that represent those areas come to agreement. I mean, at the end of the day, whoever's been elected to serve a given district has a majority support in that district.
And I guess I would agree with a lot of what you just said. But for instance, my district, probably the people in my district spend a lot of time in Mr. Tipton's district, and in Mr. Lamborn's district, and in Mr. Negus's district. They are users, in effect, and people who appreciate the wilderness. So they spend a lot of time there. They utilize that. And so eventually, though, there should be an agreement, but it doesn't end all or be all with you as the member of that particular area, or Mr. Tipton or Ms. DeGette. Hopefully, we can reach agreement, but at some point, you got to make a statement. She's been working on this thing since 1999. She's had 2 or 3 other members of Congress who preceded Mr. Tipton and Mr. Lamborn. So with each one, do they have a veto? I don't think so. So I guess we have kind of a difference. I agree with you. There needs to be consultation and in the best circumstances, agreement, and work on it till you get there. But at some point, you got to do it.
And you're right about all Americans using federal land. The difference is when people travel there and visit, they go back home, but there's residents that live close to that land that have to deal with that on a, 365 days out of the year. So I would think they should have a little higher standing when it comes to how you
Okay.
allocate land in those areas.
That's fair.
If I may say, though, the residents in those areas do support the wilderness designation.
And I yield back to the chair.
Mr. Woodall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a brief question. I've got the most used national recreation area in the country in my district, the Chattahoochee National Recreation Area. Thinking about trying to listen to the voters. If the voters in my district want to make that national recreation area less national and more recreation, I would expect my colleagues here to say, no, this is a national resource, and just because your voters want to develop it all into condominiums doesn't mean we're going to do that, because the other 49 states and 434 other congressional districts have a say. What's the difference when we're swinging the pendulum towards more protection as opposed to less protection? I know my colleagues would reject less protection on a simple district vote, but it seems very compelling for more protection when the voters support it there.
So if I can try to tackle that question, as I mentioned, 2/3 of the areas in my bill, and I can't really speak for the other 5 bills in the package, but 2/3 of the areas in my bill are already being managed as wilderness because they're wilderness study areas. And with respect to the rest of the areas, these are areas, they are very, very remote in Colorado, and they have been selected for this bill because they do not have the trammeling of man. So in other words, they're already pretty much wilderness as it is. They don't have roads, they don't have oil and gas development, and so they're just basically being protected for what they already are. And I would also like to point out that even if this bill is approved, it'll still be less than 10% of the public lands in Colorado that would be designated as wilderness, because it's my view, and I think this is something we could all agree, for those of us from the West, that wilderness should really be reserved only for those very few areas that have those characteristics envisioned by the Wilderness Act, which is an area that is untrammeled by man and that does not have all of these oil and gas development, roads, motorized vehicles, et cetera.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you very much, Ms. Scanlon. Dr. Burgess?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to what Mr. Woodall had suggested, the pendulum swings towards more protection, okay, but or towards more development, and we want to provide more protection. But if we're providing more, if we're including an area to be included in that more protected area, where there is already an activity going on, how do we reconcile that? How do we tell that person they can no longer do the logging, mining, whatever is going on in that area that we now wish to include in an expanded national recreation area?
So as I said, at least in the areas in the Colorado Wilderness Act, there's none of the areas are areas where we're removing any of these types of activities. Rather, we're preserving them for the current wilderness protections that they have. And some would argue that what we're doing in protecting them, I would argue this, in protecting what's already there as what we recognize as wilderness, we're actually increasing the commercial opportunities for outdoor recreation, which in states like Colorado, California, and Washington State have now become one of the top areas of our economy in those states.
Mr. Westerman, did you have hearings on all of these titles in this bill?
We did have several hearings on the bills, and, on the outdoor recreation side of it, a wilderness area, you can have any kind of mechanized vehicles in it. You can't have a bicycle in it. You know, mountain biking is something that's very popular now, but you take that off the table. You take off using any kind of mechanized equipment inside the wilderness area. So I think the opportunities for recreation are much greater if you don't designate something wilderness area than when you designate it wilderness area.
So Title V of this bill, the Rim of the Valley Corridor Preservation, did you have a hearing on that?
Which one was that?
Title V?
Yeah,
The Rim of the Valley?
We did.
Did you talk about what happens to the ongoing commercial concerns that are now in this new part that has, my understanding is it's non-contiguous, but is being added to the wilderness area?
Yeah, I believe there were discussions on that in the hearing.
So how are we reconciling those activities that are already going on? And I guess they'll be prohibited if we pass this bill, it gets signed into law, it's a new recreation area, and a gravel mining concern can no longer continue. Is that going to be the case?
You asking?
Yes, I'm asking you, because you were there at the hearing. I wasn't there.
So if it becomes wilderness area, by the definition of wilderness, all activities like that would have to cease.
Mr.
So
Burgess, I can answer that. The Rim of the Valley area, that's Section 5 that you are asking about, is not a wilderness area. So it would depend on what the land management decision, whether you could have a gravel pit there or not.
So as we consider amendments, I see Mr. McClintock of California has an amendment, number 11, to allow the Secretary of Agriculture or Secretary of the Interior, as appropriate, to exclude from wilderness designations under this act any areas that do not meet the definition of wilderness in the Wilderness Act. So I think that would be, Mr. Chairman, I hope we will consider that and consider making that in order, because I think it should be debated and voted on the floor as part of this. So I thank you all for your presentations today. I'll yield back.
Ms. Lesko?
I'll just briefly comment. You know, in Arizona, a lot of federal land, as well as in most of the western states, and it's unlike the Northeast. And so our education system, everything, it's not funded as much because there's so much federal land. And I just oppose this legislation on a number of fronts, but one of them is when you have a member of Congress that actually opposes it and represents the area, that's troublesome, and not allowing people to have bicycles even on this land, that's troubling, because it's the public's land, right? The government is the public, and they should be able to use it, and I don't think we should be regulating any more land well, let's put it this way, than the land that's proposed in this bill. So I yield back.
Mr. DeSaulnier? All right. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today, and please leave anything that you would have inserted into the record with our stenographer. And you're now excused. I'm very pleased at this time to tell Mr. Tipton that we're delighted that you're here, and anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. And I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton.
All right. So, we already did
Mr.
this?
Tipton. Oh, he's up.
Okay. Mr. Tipton, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman. And do appreciate the time, appreciate the committee taking time to be able to hear some amendments that we'd like to be able to propose on the bill, and understand from Mr. Hastings that it'll be entered into the record. But I do have a letter from Montezuma County and Dolores County asking that we maintain multiple use status in regards to Weber Mountain, Menifee Mountain, Cajon Canyon, Cross Canyon, Squaw, and Papoose Canyons in regards to Title I of the legislation. So, Mr. Chairman, today I'm here to be able to advocate for 3 amendments that I've offered to Title I of the Protecting America's Wilderness Act. First, I'd like to say that I'm not opposed to wilderness designations if the areas proposed for the designation hold true wilderness characteristics and the community in which the land is located overwhelmingly supports designation. The First Amendment that I've offered gets to that point. Two of the wilderness designations that the bill's sponsor has proposed in the Rules Committee are currently wilderness study areas in Montezuma County, Colorado. In March of last year, I introduced a bill that would add more federal land to Montezuma County through an expansion of the Yucca House National Monument, Montezuma County. And Montezuma County offered its support for this bill on the condition that we work to be able to release select wilderness study areas that the BLM has studied and found not to be suitable for wilderness. Included in the list were Weber Menifee Mountain, Cross Canyon, and Squam Papoose Canyon. Montezuma County is seeking also to be able to release these WSAs to help the county better manage a noxious weed issue and to be able to address the challenges that are created when private lands run up against federal land being managed as wilderness. Therefore, my First Amendment strikes the inclusion of the Cross Canyon and Weber Menifee Wilderness additions, which total almost 39,000 acres of land that the BLM has determined is not suitable for wilderness. The bill's sponsor has also offered an amendment today that would convert the Squam Papoose Wilderness Study Area into the wilderness. I'd like to note that both Montezuma County and Dolores County oppose this addition. My Second and Third Amendment are important to our nation's national security interests and concern military aviation training by our armed forces in Colorado. My district is home to the national level asset of the high-altitude Army National Guard Aviation Training Site known as HATS, whose military aviation training mission is critical to the readiness of our armed forces, something that has been recognized by this House of Representatives. Title I seeks to establish 5 wilderness or special potential wilderness areas within the HATS training area. As wilderness legislation continues to be debated and introduced in Congress, it is important to have information on exactly how wilderness designations impact the readiness of our armed forces. Therefore, my amendment number 6 would require that the Secretary of Defense must conduct a study which would examine the impacts of the expansion of wilderness designations in the western United States and what that would have on the readiness of our armed forces as it relates to aviation training. In addition, my amendment number 7 would restore the military helicopter overflights and operations language from the Rules Committee print being debated here today back to the language that was approved by the Committee on Natural Resources. The restored language would ensure continuance of the helicopter operations at designated landing zones in the region, which are slated to become wilderness or potential wilderness within the HATS training area. As stated in November 2019 letter to both majority and minority members of the Natural Resources Committee, the National Guard Bureau approved of the language that was passed out of committee. However, now that language has changed. I've reached out to NGB for updated analysis on the changed language in the committee print, and I'm still awaiting a reply. With no clear indication from the National Guard Bureau that they may also approve this language, I'm proposing to revert back to the language to what the bill sponsor and the Natural Resources Committee approved, and more importantly, what the NGB approved. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I was glad to join my colleague from South Carolina, Congressman Cunningham, as a co-sponsor of his amendment, which would ensure that military overflights are able to continue over wilderness areas under this act. Although this amendment does not address the issue of landing zones, I think it's an important addition to the entirety of the bill. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak on behalf of my amendments before the committee this evening, and I yield back and would answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tipton. I appreciate your testimony. Are there any questions of Mr. Tipton? Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. You mentioned that the language had changed in the Rules Committee print. Was the discussion of the National Guard Bureau's approval of the original text that the committee approved, was that an important part of the markup and the conversation, or is that something that's true but wasn't relevant at the time of the discussion?
Well, I believe it's relevant. It's something we'd reached out, and that's why we're now asking for the National Guard to be able to give their input on the language that you are debating in this committee today to be able to move to the floor. We don't know. We have yet to be able to receive a response from them, So the amendment would just turn it back to what was approved in committee and then also approved by the National Guard Bureau.
I support the inclusion of all these amendments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further amendments? Further questions? Dr. Burgess?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't have a specific question. I do think all of your amendments that you've brought for us today should be made in order. But Mr. Tipton, as the discussion was going on as to whether or not the member that represents an area should have a say one way or the other in things, I couldn't help but remember the experience with the Gold King mine and the Environmental Protection Agency in your district. And it was one of the most startling things I've ever seen. You were kind enough to let me visit. We know our districts sometimes better than the federal agencies, and I think it's appropriate to consult with members of Congress when something that order of magnitude is contemplated. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. All of his amendments should be made in order. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Oh, did you have one, Mr. Pimmerman?
No, I just wanted to say, I like having Colorado.
Okay. Thank you very much. Here, sir. Leave your testimony for the stenographer. That'd be great. Great. Anybody else wish to testify? Seeing none, that closes the hearing portion of what is it? HR. What's the number? HR 2546. With that, the chair will be in receipt of a motion, and I yield to the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 2546, the Colorado Wilderness Act of 2019. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate on the bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-50 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule provides for consideration of H.J. Res. 79, removing the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate on the joint resolution, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the joint resolution. The rule provides that the amendments in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary, now printed in the joint resolution, shall be considered as adopted, and the joint resolution as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the joint resolution as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule provides that House Resolution 842 is hereby adopted. Section 4 of the rule provides that on any legislative day during the period from February 14, 2020 through February 24, 2020, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. Finally, the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 4. I yield back.
You heard the motion of the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. I just would note that on H.R. 2546, there are 12 amendments made in order, 5 Democratic, 6 Republican, and 1 bipartisan. When I walked to Mr. Burgess, you asked about amendment number 11, sponsored by Mr. McClintock. You'll be happy to know that that was made in order. But at this point, are there any amendments or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for making so many amendments in order, and I mean that in all sincerity. It's a welcome step in being inclusive, and I appreciate it. However, and I note on 2546, both sides have said they want as broad a consultation as we could have. We've got a pretty light week here, been 14 months. We haven't had an open rule yet. I thought this is the perfect opportunity. Light week, everybody wants to talk about this bill, so I would move that we have an open rule for H.R. 2546, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Any comments or debate? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 9
The
nays.
amendment is not agreed to. Further amendment. I know. I kept on trying to do that to you, but I couldn't succeed, so we'll keep on trying. Maybe we'll get one. I know. I won't surprise you yet. All right, not today, though. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at Section 3 of the rule and am concerned by it for folks who hadn't seen it yet. It makes an order of resolution that I think has just been introduced, H.Res. 842 by Mr. Raskin, which declares by House resolution
It's in your folder if you're looking for it.
that the rules set forth by the Constitution about how to pass constitutional amendments are hereby changed or not, don't apply. It makes no sense that a non-binding House resolution would have any impact on the constitutionality of changing the constitutionality of changing the language of an amendment without a two-thirds majority vote. But at the very least, it doesn't deserve to be hidden in a self-adopted part of a rule. I think Mr. Raskin deserves better than that for his legislative text, and I move that we strike that section of the rule.
Mr. Raskin's a very humble guy. He doesn't need a lot of attention.
Jamie Raskin is who I'm talking about.
I thought you were talking about the president's lawyer, Jane Raskin.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion, debate? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
can I get a recorded vote?
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess?
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chairman.
Woodall.
At the very least, we should expose H.Res. 842 to a vote on the floor of the House. We've not done anything like this in the 10 years I've been in Congress. I just want to make sure folks understand what we're talking about. The plain language of the ERA amendment says, when ratified by legislatures of 3/4 of the several states within 7 years from the date of its submission to Congress. Now, I recognize that the president from my home state, President Carter, signed language similar to the language we're going to be debating on the floor of the House, and I recognize that because no other states ratified the amendment during that time, those legal challenges never went through. But it seems incredibly dangerous to suggest that I can change any of the words in this amendment by a simple majority vote. For example, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged. The proposition here is that I could change that to equality of the rights under the law shall be denied or abridged by any state on the basis of sex. That all needs a simple majority vote on the floor of the House. That's nonsense. But it is certainly of such import that it deserves a separate vote on the floor of the House. Whatever it is, whatever the legal scholars have said that they think a non-binding House resolution is going to impact litigation in some way, it's not. But whatever it is that folks believe, they have to believe that it would be more helpful to them in litigation if we actually vote on it than if we don't vote on it. So my amendment is under a typical closed rule that this committee would proffer, that we amend Section 3 to say, rather than hereby adopted, say upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the resolution HRES 842 under a closed rule. It would accomplish the same goal the majority is trying to accomplish. And I would argue, and I'd be happy to have constructive counsel, but if this is to help in some sort of litigation, it would be better if we voted on it and had a roll call vote on it than if we just deemed it to have passed. Deeming things to have passed, in my reading of constitutional history, has never, ever, ever positively impacted a lawsuit. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further comments or discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Me, the chair, the noes have it.
I was watching the sponsor to see if he was enthusiastically a no, and I'd like a roll call vote so I can see for sure.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Askin?
With great enthusiasm, no.
Mr. Askin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess?
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Further amendments? Hearing none, the vote is now on the motion from the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Me, the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, we'd like a roll call, please.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Askin? Mr. Askin, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall?
No.
Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess?
No.
Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
And the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, will carry it for the... No, the motion is agreed to. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, will carry it for the Democrats.
Mr. Chairman, gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, will carry it.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.
I asked the favorite Alcee Hastings question.
Anything? I hope.